Thanks, Tom and Alex, for leading us this morning. Great songs to begin the year together. Just a couple of announcements for us this morning. For Sunday school, we have Sunday school coming back on the 6th of February, around the time that school comes back. That'll be for prep to kindy, year 1 to year 5, starting 6th of Feb. And so in the meantime, we're just going to keep it light and simple for this month together. This month we're looking at Matthew chapter 18, what Jesus says about his community. And so we want to look at these words from Jesus this month in Matthew 18. All right. In a moment I'm going to open the Bible and look at Matthew 18 with us together this morning. But after the message today, we do have our time in communion, and so looking forward to that time to take in the bread and the cup together this morning. All right, Matthew chapter 18. If you have a Bible or if you can look at it online, Matthew chapter 18. And it's the first 4 verses. I'm going to read these verses out loud. Matthew chapter 18. At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." These are God's words. I was thinking about a year ago at the end of 2020, and we were relieved to have gone through that period of COVID and just really seeing clear skies ahead for 2021. It's not going to be like this past year, is what we said. Little realizing what was going to happen, and to go through a lockdown that was more extensive and more strict, and to see COVID continue to spread. And we just did not know things would turn out the way they would. And when we look at the story today, this story does take a direction that's not expected. And so that's what we want to look at together this morning. This little episode where Jesus' followers have a question and it doesn't turn out the way they expect. I think that's good for us to look at the beginning of this year, 2022. We talk about Happy New Year. This could be about a humble New Year. But these are really good words for us this morning, and I hope that they'll be effective to you as well. So we're talking about becoming like a child, and that's what we're going to look at together this morning. This is the secret question. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? It says that the disciples came to Jesus with this question. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Why are they asking this question? In the previous chapter, there was a situation where some tax collectors wanted to find out if Jesus paid tax or not. And in the story it says they didn't go to Jesus, they went to one of his followers, they went to Peter. So these tax collectors, they're outsiders, but they just went to Peter thinking that Peter was the leader under Jesus, the leader of the followers. And it could be that the other disciples might have struggled to accept this. Maybe they found that difficult, that Peter was seen as the leader among the disciples. And then again in the previous chapter, chapter 17, Jesus had told his followers that he would be taken and killed and then raised again on the 3rd day. And when Jesus told them this, the disciples were, it says, greatly distressed. So if you've ever received bad news, your head's spinning, your heart's throbbing, and you're in a whirl mentally. And I think especially for the men who are following Jesus, there's a sense of, well, what can we do? What needs to be done? Right? There's a sense of crisis from what Jesus has told them. How can we be prepared? Right? I think in corporate language we'd be talking about risk assessment here. How do we reduce the risk What's happening here? I'm sure someone would have asked the question, and I'm just speculating, but I'm sure someone was thinking, well, what's the plan of succession? What's the succession if something happens to Jesus? Who's next? Just in case. And again, I'm just speculating, but it would just be plausible and natural to be thinking along these lines. Who's next in line? And so they come to this question, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And that question would involve various facets. Your character, what kind of person are you? Your competence, what are you able to do? What are your abilities and skills? Your closeness to Jesus, because Jesus did have some that were closer to him in a sense than others, right? Previously, Jesus had transfigured, shown who he was on the inside, and there were only 3 disciples that saw that, Peter, James, and John. Who's closer to Jesus? When we're asking who is the greatest, we're talking about roles. You know, what's your role? What's your role in this movement? And I think this is something where I think all of us can understand this. We do like to rank ourselves in some way or another. We do this with movies, you know, we do this with experiences. We definitely do this at work, right? And on the lines of performance, how do we rank ourselves? And so this question, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, we can all relate to that because we've asked ourselves that question in different ways, right? Within this circle, you know, who is the most, you know, talented or the most secure or the most attractive or the most accomplished? We ask ourselves, in a way, that question all the time. We like to be good value. We like to recognize performance. And so this is really actually a natural question. Jesus, in your view, who is the greatest, you know, in the rankings? Who's in the rankings? In the story, it says that they came to Jesus with this question. But actually, that is not as direct as it looks, that they came to Jesus with this question. It's interesting that we see the same story in another gospel, Mark chapter 9. And in that version, Mark chapter 9, they were traveling, they came to a house, and when they settled in, Jesus said to them, "What were you talking about along the way?" And it says in Mark chapter 9, they kept silent because they had been arguing about who was the greatest. Okay? So they didn't really, at least at first, own up to the fact that they were asking this question. They kept silent about it. Then we have another gospel, in Luke, that also tells this story. So we've got 3 versions of this story. And in Luke chapter 9, same situation, it says, Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and explained to them. So that phrase, Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, what does that indicate? That this is actually a secret question. Okay? I don't think, at least at first, they were really saying it like this. I think it started in their hearts. What really mattered to them on the inside. This is where the question is being asked. Who's the greatest? It's on the inside. And what I love about this is Jesus knows the reasoning of their hearts. I love that phrase because it's not just describing Jesus when he deals with his enemies, like the Pharisees and the teachers. It also refers to Jesus with his followers. So Jesus knows what his followers are really thinking on the inside and their rationale. And so it's a secret question, but Jesus knows it. And so he responds to them. And he shows that this is actually a big problem. Thanks, Micah. That this is a problem. We already know that this was something that was causing an argument. This was potentially divisive. This question of, well, where do I fit in the rankings? You know, who's the greatest? It causes arguments. We can see that later on when the church was growing in the Corinthian church. there was an issue about people saying, well, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos. Some said, no, I just follow Jesus. And that issue of the rankings is a divisive question. And how would you expect Jesus to respond to it? I think this is a fascinating response, because if someone says, who's the greatest in the kingdom, right? There are different ways you could have responded to this question. If you were in a company as an employee asking, who's the greatest in this company? And you ask the executive that question, I think the executive would really see this as an opportunity, right? Oh, you want to know who's the greatest? Well, here's what you have to do to be the greatest, all right? This is how you have to perform. These are the goals to achieve. This is an opportunity to show that you are the greatest, right? And this happens a lot at work, right? If you have that ambition or that interest, then let me take that and just use that to accomplish more for the company. That's a typical corporate response, right? Even a religious response would be similar. If you said, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Well, here's the pathway, here are the steps you need to take in order that you can make progress as a follower of Jesus so that you can achieve this level, this higher level of getting closer to God. Here's what you have to do. But what does Jesus do actually? He doesn't take their words and manipulate his followers. He doesn't take their words and try to twist them into more action. Instead, he takes a child. Of all things to do, he takes a child. One of the other Gospels says, into his arms. So it's a small child, a little child, and shows this child around to his followers. Now, what's interesting is that each version of this story, the three versions, they all mention the same thing. And what that tells you is that for the people in the room at that moment, they never forgot this moment. That Jesus, in response to what they were asking and arguing about, shows them a child. They've all carried this in their mind. And then he says to them, truly I say to you. Now, if you've read some of Jesus' words, when Jesus really wants to make a point, he says, truly I say to you, right? I want you to get this. I want you to carry this. And there's two details that he wants them to realize. Firstly, he says, unless you turn. That's an interesting phrase. Unless you turn. And what Jesus is saying here is that when we ask ourselves, where do I fit, in this circle or in this scene? It's natural for you to think, well, I want to be at this level, or I want to have this accomplished, or I want to be at this stage. That's natural. But what Jesus is saying is that's a problem, because the natural way is not the right way. You've got to actually turn away from that kind of thinking. It's counterintuitive. It's unnatural. It's really supernatural to not carry that question. Unless you turn. And then he says, unless you turn and become like this child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So the way Jesus puts it here in Matthew is really a very strong negative. It says, unless you're like this child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. So don't ask about who's the greatest in the kingdom. If you can't be like this child, you never get to the kingdom. So this is like level 0. This is, truly I say to you, you must embrace this and take this to heart. You won't even enter God's kingdom unless you hold this in. You've got to be like a child. This reminds us about being born again. It's what the Bible talks about. Converting from your way to God's way. It's that change on the inside that God works in your heart when he breaks us down and opens us up to God. That's how you enter the kingdom, is through that kind of humility and brokenness. And if you can remember when that happened in your own life, if that's happened to you, if you can remember when you had that sense of brokenness and openness before God, and you reached out to God and you said, I know that I've gone the wrong way, but I'm giving my life over to you, God, and instead of following my way, I'm trusting in Jesus and believing what He's done for me. That conversion that happens in your heart, all right? What Jesus is saying here is that posture is the posture that we should live with for the rest of our life. It's the posture where you enter into the kingdom, and it's the posture where you grow through the kingdom. That posture of childlike humility. Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, it says, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. In the Gospel of Luke, it says, he who is least among you all is the one who is great. So this is all about humility. This does not mean that you're the person who always mopes around and there's a continual cloud over your head, it's not really like that. It's more like self-forgetfulness. Self-forgetfulness. One person said, humility is not simply feeling small and useless. It's sensing how great and glorious God is and seeing myself in that light. One other person said, I sometimes think the very essence of the whole Christian position is just to realize two things. I must have complete, absolute confidence in God and no confidence in myself. All right. Humility is not just saying, I'm nothing, I'm no good. It's also involving recognizing who God really is. Self-forgetful in the light of God. When we ask ourselves, or when we put ourselves in the position of, I'm better than you, or how does this person compare to me, that gets in the way. We're talking about pride versus humility. Humility is what allows us to accurately see and value truth. In Jesus' view, only the humble can truly see. In the Bible, it talks about how pride blinds us. It blinds us to God, it blinds us to ourselves and to what's around us. In Proverbs 16, it says pride keeps us from seeing our approaching fall, right? It's pride that is like the light for a wicked person. They're lit by pride. That's what Proverbs 21 says. Jesus says, if the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness, right? Pride is pervasive. It affects the way that we see everything. Pride sees the self as the supreme value and views everything else as a means to enhance the self. But humility helps us to see properly. Psalm 25 says, God leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, it's only the humble that can be pure in heart. Only the humble can see God. When Jesus talks about humility, he's not talking about being childish. What I mean by that is being naive and simplistic or foolish like a child can be. It's important that we realize that. 1 Corinthians 14 says, do not be children in your thinking. Be infants in your evil, but in your thinking be mature. In 1 Corinthians 13, it says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And so, when Jesus says to be like a child, Jesus doesn't mean that we stay childish in our thinking and be immature. And that's not what Jesus means. As you grow, you want to make right decisions and see things correctly. That's what we want for everybody in their progress. Obviously, you wouldn't expect someone who's older to think the way that they did when they were 5. There's got to be progress and maturity. 1 Thessalonians says, test everything. Hold fast to what is good. A child is mentally not able to do all of that, right? The Bible says you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, and it says also with all your mind. So we need to have that growing and thinking. One writer says, trust like a child, think like an adult. All right? Goes on to say we should grow up in our thinking so that we can grow down in our humility, so that we can have faith like a child. So once again, we're not advocating to be immature like a child or naive like a child, foolish like a child. We're very much talking about growing in our capacity and thinking, but to have that sense of humble trust. Thanks, Micah. How do we get this humble trust? In verse 4, Jesus says, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And you have to think a little bit, what is a child like? You know, a child is vulnerable, right? Not able, right, to provide for themselves. They're in positions of danger, and they don't know it a lot of the time. They're vulnerable. All kinds of things can happen to children, and that's why we have so many protections and processes and that mindfulness to safeguard children because they're vulnerable, right? Many times you just see this happen. Running into the road, right? Jumping into the water, climbing a tree. The list is just goes on and on. Vulnerable, 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 vulnerable. Now, as we grow, it's interesting how we make commitments and put in a lot of effort to reduce our vulnerability, right? As a child, maybe someone laughed at you because you weren't able to do this or you didn't have this. And we receive that and we think, well, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to get past that. And we just continue that sense of, well, because I'm vulnerable, I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do more. I'm not going to be in that position that I used to be in, right? We do so much to sustain ourselves and to be independent. Jesus says, you've got to become like a child. So maybe it's not so much about trusting in what we've done to sustain ourselves or to be independent, but to accept the fact that life is fragile and that we all are vulnerable in the eyes of God, and not to foolishly presume that somehow we're bulletproof just because we've got more money or because we've got more things or because we've got a plan and we're seeing progress. But we are still vulnerable. Children are dependent, aren't they? How much they rely on care and direction from others. They are dependent. And a big part of our story is how we grow and we take our opportunities and look at how we're flourishing and look at how independent I am. And that's the step that Jesus is putting his finger on here. When we grow to the point where we think, I don't need anything, I've left the realm of the child. And that's actually not a good thing in Jesus' view, because we still are dependent. Jesus said, man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word from the mouth of God. We are still dependent, whether we realize it or not. And children are trusting. Children assume that somebody more wise, more capable will cover the need. They're trusting. They just give it over to the person above them to take care of it. And when Jesus says, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest, do you know what Jesus is really saying there? He's really pointing to himself. He's implicitly saying to them, follow me, trust in me, look at the kind of person I am and what I'm going to do for you. Because here they are, They're concerned about what's going to happen to them. They're in crisis. They struggle to accept the dynamic of the group, and they naturally come back to, well, I'm better than you, you're not better than me. And Jesus says, watch what I'm going to do for you. All right, I'll be that child. I will put myself in the vulnerable position. Right? I'll be the one who's taken and abandoned. I'll be the one who cries out to the Father, right? If it be possible, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you want. I'll be the one who's dependent. I'll be the one who entrusts myself into the justice of God. When I allow myself to be taken and lay my life down and to be crucified. Jesus is the humble one. He is the greatest one. And that's how we gain our humble trust. When we take our eyes off those concerns and questions and we look back to Jesus in his suffering on the cross, the risen Lord, and we see what he's done for me. He's not just shown the way forward for us, he's actually made the way possible for us in that he covers our pride, he covers our complaints, he covers our insecurities, he covers our failures in what he's done in his ultimate work of humility on the cross. Next week we'll be talking about how do we have this humble trust in God when we're struggling with temptation and we're battling our own failures and sins. How do we humbly trust in God there? How do we humbly trust in God when other people offend us? And that's a big part of our community, because the more we grow together, the more we're going to tread on each other's toes and cause problems whether we realize it or not, as part of community. And so we'll be looking at these in the weeks ahead.